absolutely, accidentally, accordingly, accurately, actively, actually, additionally, adequately, admittedly, affectionately, afterward, almost, altogether, amazingly, angrily, annually, anxiously, apparently, approximately, arbitrarily, arguably, around, artificially, aside, astonishingly, automatically, badly, barely, beautifully, beforehand, believably, bitterly, blindly, boldly, briefly, brilliantly, broadly, busily, calmly, carefully, carelessly, certainly, cheaply, cheerfully, clearly, closely, coincidentally, comfortably, commonly, comparatively, completely, concurrently, confidently, consciously, consequently, considerably, consistently, constantly, continually, continuously, conveniently, correctly, courageously, critically, crucially, curiously, currently, daily, dangerously, daringly, decisively, deeply, deliberately, delicately, delightfully, densely, desperately, differently, diligently, directly, distinctly, doubtfully, dramatically, dreadfully, eagerly, easily, effectively, efficiently, effortlessly, elaborately, elegantly, elsewhere, emotionally, emphatically, entirely, equally, especially, essentially, eventually, evidently, exactly, exclusively, explicitly, extensively, extraordinarily, extremely, fairly, faithfully, familiarly, far, fashionably, fast, fatally, favorably, fearfully, fiercely, finally, firmly, fluently, fondly, foolishly, formally, fortunately, frankly, freely, frequently, frightfully, fully, fundamentally, generally, gently, genuinely, gladly, gracefully, gradually, gratefully, greatly, happily, hard, hardly, hastily, healthily, heavily, helpfully, highly, honestly, hopefully, hopelessly, horizontally, horribly, hourly, however, humorously, hurriedly, ideally, identically, immediately, immensely, impatiently, implicitly, importantly, impressively, inappropriately, incredibly, independently, indifferently, individually, inevitably, informally, initially, innocently, inquisitively, instantly, intellectually, intelligently, intensely, intentionally, interestingly, internally, internationally, intimately, invariably, invisibly, involuntarily, ironically, irregularly, irresponsibly, joyfully, keenly, kindly, lately, legally, lightly, likely, literally, logically, loosely, loudly, luckily, madly, mainly, manually, markedly, meaningfully, mechanically, merely, merrily, mildly, miraculously, miserably, moderately, momentarily, mostly, mysteriously, naturally, nearly, neatly, negatively, nervously, nicely, normally, notably, nowadays, obviously, occasionally, officially, openly, optimistically, orally, originally, outwardly, painfully, partially, particularly, patiently, perfectly, periodically, permanently, personally, physically, plainly, pleasantly, politely, poorly, positively, potentially, powerfully, practically, precisely, preferably, presently, primarily, promptly, properly, publicly, purely, quickly, quietly, randomly, rapidly, rarely, readily, really, reasonably, recently, regularly, relatively, reliably, reluctantly, remarkably, repeatedly, respectfully, responsibly, restlessly, roughly, routinely, sadly, safely, satisfactorily, scarcely, securely, seemingly, seldom, selectively, sensibly, separately, seriously, sharply, shortly, shyly, silently, similarly, simply, sincerely, slightly, slowly, smoothly, solemnly, solidly, sometimes, somewhat, soon, specifically, speedily, steadily, strategically, strictly, strongly, stubbornly, subsequently, successfully, suddenly, sufficiently, suitably, superficially, surprisingly, suspiciously, swiftly, symbolically, systematically, technically, temporarily, tenderly, terribly, thankfully, thoroughly, thoughtfully, thus, tightly, timely, tirelessly, totally, traditionally, tragically, truly, typically, ultimately, uncomfortably, unfortunately, universally, unnecessarily, unusually, urgently, usefully, uselessly, usually, vaguely, vainly, vastly, verbally, vigorously, violently, virtually, visibly, voluntarily, warmly, weakly, wearily, weirdly, well, widely, wildly, wisely, wonderfully, wrongly, yearly, yesterday,